Rocksteady's Batman Arkham games are some of the best superhero titles of all time. The Trilogy, Arkham Asylum, Arkham City, and the spectacular Arkham Knight are polished and beautiful action games. But their recent Switch ports do seem a bit curious. The first two titles make sense, as games that were developed around the Xbox 360 and PS3. But Arkham Knight was a boundary-pushing last-gen game that doesn't seem like a good fit for Switch, with visuals that would require careful retooling to run effectively on Nintendo's low-power hybrid console. So has Arkham Knight survived the inevitable visual hits necessary to run on aging mobile hardware? And what about the other two, less demanding titles? Batman Arkham Knight is an absolute disaster on Switch. There are a lot of problems here, but performance is by far its biggest flaw. In broad strokes, we're looking at sub 30 FPS frame rates, with near constant drops, especially during open world traversal. 20 to 25 FPS readouts are common as we glide above the city, with frame rates stabilizing somewhat once we're on the ground. That part is bad enough, but look at the frame time graph. The game suffers from frequent stutters, often over 100 milliseconds, with a lot of frame time variance. That means that the game feels subjectively even worse than the top-line frame rates would indicate, and you will briefly see Batman seem to jerk back in this footage every so often when the frame rates are dropping, which seems to be a byproduct of the camera continuing to move while Batman remains stationary for a frame. It feels a lot like the rubber banding effect players of some online multiplayer games might have experienced, like in older Battlefield titles. It gets worse. When we enter the Batmobile and engage in a high-speed chase here, the game takes an even bigger framerate tumble, with a wildly inconsistent frame time readout. Arkham Knight is legitimately quite challenging to play here with all of the constant stuttering. It's hard to express how poor the game actually feels to control. A locked 20 FPS, for instance, would feel a lot better than this. I suspect the game's streaming systems are causing serious issues here. That's not all. We get the occasional super high frame time spike. This pause, for instance, lasts for over 2 seconds. These pop up pretty regularly if you just drive around the city for a bit, really pulling you out of the experience. And the game sometimes hangs at 0 FPS indefinitely, or at least it does when it crashes, which happened twice over the time I played Arkham Knight. The game needed to be manually closed here, which took a while. These glitches are an occasional painful reminder of the game's basic instability. Some sections of the game do run more acceptably. On-foot gameplay can sometimes hit and hold 30 FPS for extended periods. Indoor areas tend to run a bit better as well, though these can suffer from substantial frame rate issues at times. Basically, if you haven't got much of the city in view and you aren't moving very quickly, there's a decent chance you'll be at or near 30 FPS. But a lot of Arkham Knight's gameplay is just the opposite. Even if Arkham Knight was a visual match for its home console counterparts, its performance would render it impossible to recommend. But unfortunately, there are a wide range of graphical cuts here relative to last-gen home consoles, which make it an unattractive game as well as a jerky one. I think focusing on the micro detail is a good place to start. Look at this electrical panel here. Texture resolution is hugely degraded, we lose the high voltage and danger indicators and the reddish grime, and the material properties are simplified, without a specular sheen. The game is just barely recognizable here. This glass cabinetry loses almost all of its lighting detail, with zero shadowing whatsoever. And look at the glass, which has very nice shading on Xbox One, but appears to be totally transparent on Switch, a simplification which makes this scene look strange. We also see vast lighting differences and stripped back material properties when we look at this elevator. The bookshelf shot here effectively shows off another key cutback, the complete removal of ambient occlusion on Switch. Obviously, the Switch version looks much worse in these comparisons, but critically, I think it just no longer looks much like Arkham Knight. The moody, mechanical world of Gotham loses a lot of its character when most of the lighting detail has been stripped out, and textures and materials are harshly decimated. A lot of the same concessions are evident at a distance. At this angle, we can see just how deep the cuts can run, with extremely low resolution textures plastering the environment below. Distant geometry is pared back as well, which is noticeable if you run your eyes along the skyline here. Also see how the distant city geometry has been replaced with a row of simple, tall buildings, presumably as a performance-sparing measure. When we drive through the city, we see some pretty severe pop-in as a result of these LOD compromises. Looking down at street level, there's typically far less enemy commotion and traffic than before as well, which probably saves valuable CPU cycles. And the clouds in the sky have been greatly simplified. The bat signal texture remains, but is at a laughably low resolution. Also note the rain here. While it is present and looks perfectly fine, its volume has been reduced compared to Xbox One. Characters look much more basic, lacking much of the detail that we see on last-gen systems. Like the rest of the game, they lack shadow maps, instead featuring crude blob shadows at their feet. And the cutscene sequences have been cropped in somewhat with a tighter framing of the action. This may simply be another way the developers have tried to claw back a little bit of performance. The roiling, finely tessellated waves on last-gen home consoles have been pared back a lot on Switch, with the new water surface mostly getting by with the usual normal map tricks instead. The water is probably my favorite visual element from the other versions of this game, and this downgrade does hurt, though a big cut here was probably inevitable. The post-processing has also been cut back. Depth of field looks a little bit worse, with less defined bokeh shapes. The most obvious cut here has to be the motion blur though, which has been completely stripped out of the Switch release. This is another visual element that really made the prior Arkham Knight releases look special, so its absence is deeply felt, especially during high-speed traversal. When driving, you'll also notice that the destructible elements often simply pop out of existence when hit too, with none of the physicalized debris that we saw on last-gen consoles. As a final note, some of the game's optimizations may have had a substantial gameplay impact. Take this minigame for instance. The idea is that you need to use the two analog sticks to search for a location on the map that matches both types of signals, with waveform effects to guide you. On Xbox One, it's pretty simple, but on Switch these graphics are totally gone, so the minigame is ruined. I just swung the sticks around for a minute or two until I hit the right result by accident. This kind of issue really shouldn't have passed QA. Resolution-wise, we're looking at an 810p res in docked play on Switch here, without dynamic res, which fares up okay against the 900p frame on Xbox One. There's no anti-aliasing on Switch, so it does tend to look somewhat rough around the edges. Image quality isn't great on Switch really, but the game has bigger issues. In portable play, the overall experience is substantially similar. Subjectively speaking, the performance is about the same, and visual settings seem largely unchanged except for resolution, which comes in at 540p. The game perhaps fares ever so slightly better as a portable experience, though it's still in very poor shape. With Arkham Knight out of the way, I'm going to go through the last two games a bit more briskly. Arkham Asylum and Arkham City are two games that originate on PS3 and 360 hardware, so they seem like a more natural fit for the Switch. Both titles did receive a port to last-gen systems in 2016, in the Return to Arkham collection. This brought key visual enhancements over the 7th-gen console versions, here represented by their PC counterparts, running at high settings at 720p, like better materials and reworked lighting, facilitated in part from their conversion from Unreal Engine 3 to Unreal Engine 4. Not all of the changes were for the better necessarily, and some of the character of the Arkham game's visuals was lost in translation, but I think on the whole they were an improvement. The Switch versions of Asylum and City do not seem based on the Return to Arkham code, as they lack these changes. Compared to the PC versions of the original games, they are essentially a match in terms of basic visual features. Arkham City looks very similar to its PC version. The shadows are probably the biggest exception, as these self-shadows are visibly higher resolution than the PC code here. but the self-shadows do seem to exhibit some minor alignment issues at times, which I didn't notice on PC. The depth of field in the background of the city environment here is absent on Switch as well, and the game does seem to have some issues with texture loading, as high-resolution textures sometimes take quite some time to appear. The Switch version renders at up to 1080p here in docked play and up to 720p portably, though there's no anti-aliasing whatsoever. Dynamic resolution is in effect, with the docked mode usually coming in around 900p, though it's usually at 720p in handheld play. Arkham Asylum is a close match for the PC code here as well. I couldn't spot any shadow alignment problems or texture issues though, or any significant deviations from PC. Resolution-wise, Asylum is a match for City, with the same dynamic 1080p, 720p split, and similar typical resolutions. In terms of basic visual settings, neither one of these 7th gen conversions is in especially bad shape, but performance is unusually poor. Arkham Asylum fares especially badly. Here the game is usually dropping frames, and often hangs in the mid-20s for extended periods. There's also some frame time inconsistencies that seem unrelated to overall performance. Asylum just doesn't feel good to play in this form, with totally inexplicable framerate issues. I really don't understand why this title is running so poorly, considering its 2009 vintage, and that it's mostly set in cramped indoor spaces. Weirdly though, in portable mode, Arkham Asylum runs substantially better, at least judged by eye. The game still drops frames frequently, but its framerate fluctuations tend to be more minor. Arkham City also has issues. This title suffers from framerate dips from time to time, especially in broad views of Gotham City or during combat encounters. There are plenty of one-off dropped frames and little frame time wobbles as well, but the overall experience is more consistent than Arkham Asylum, and decent stretches of the game do run at 30 FPS. Portable play feels about the same as the docked mode here. Batman Arkham Knight on Switch is the worst performing game I have reviewed to date at Digital Foundry. It's in an unacceptable, unsaleable state with maddening framerate issues. Visual quality takes a big hit as well, with the game stripped of most lighting and model detail, giving it an unfinished look. It's nothing like some of the more elegant 8th gen Switch conversions we've seen from other developers, and fails to meet basic standards for playability. The results here are sort of understandable, given Arkham Knight's visual quality and heavy customization around the capabilities of last-gen home consoles. But if this was the best result that was reasonably achievable, it simply shouldn't have been ported. The other two titles do fare better, but they aren't as good as I expected. Both games have their own performance issues, with Arkham Asylum in particular suffering from prolonged framerate tumbles. For games that originated on the 360 and PS3, the results are below par. All three titles do have one potentially problematic element in common though, Unreal Engine 3. UE3 isn't actually officially supported on Switch hardware, with Epic instead pegging Unreal Engine 4 for Switch use. On the surface, that seems like it might explain some of the issues in Arkham City and Asylum in particular. But there are a decent bunch of Switch ports that use UE3 to good effect, including BioShock Infinite, Bulletstorm, Paladins, Rocket League, Mortal Kombat 11, and the first 3 Borderlands games. The studio responsible for the Arkham Trilogy collection, Turn Me Up, actually ported those Borderlands titles as well, which run with good visual settings at a stable 30 FPS. It's not clear that this pair of aged Unreal Engine 3 titles should have been any different. So at this point, I have to mark the Batman Arkham Trilogy as a failure. None of the games here live up to expectations, and Arkham Knight is just atrocious. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content. And to get in touch, use social media. Thanks for watching.